"You're nothing but a burden," my own son said to me, right there in the doctor's office. The word hit harder than any illness could. In that single moment, years of sacrifice, love, and devotion were erased. I walked out with a silence so heavy, it felt like the world had shifted, and I knew something inside me had broken forever. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I've spent most of my life with the salt of the sea in my lungs and the grease of old engines under my nails. My name is Walter Hale, and for 40 years I worked as a marine mechanic on the coast of Maine. Some men know the language of ledgers or the elegance of polished shoes. I knew the guttural hum of a motor coming back to life, and the way winter winds slice through your jacket when you're bent over a boat in February. Retirement came not because I wanted it, but because my body finally told me to stop. My knees ached, my back locked, and I could no longer crawl through engine compartments the way I once did. When my wife Ellen died, everything about the house grew quieter than I could stand. Ethan, our son, was just 8. I remember walking into his room the night of her funeral, finding him curled on the bed, clutching the last scarf she had worn. I promised him then I would never let him feel abandoned. From that moment, I took every shift I could find, sometimes coming home just in time to pack his lunch before school. I learned to nap in the corners of shipyards and in the front seat of my pickup. Every paycheck disappeared into tuition, baseball gloves, and grocery bills. I wasn't rich in money, but I was rich in determination. Ethan always had shoes that fit, even if mine had cardboard tucked under the soles. He had hot meals even when I skipped dinner. On his birthdays, there was always a cake, sometimes lopsided, sometimes made from scraps, but always there. When he needed help with algebra, I stayed up bleary-eyed, fumbling with formulas I barely remembered, just to keep him from falling behind. I thought those sacrifices would build him into a man who understood loyalty, who respected effort. Years went by, and Ethan grew tall, his shoulders broad from sports I paid for. I sat in the bleachers every Saturday, smelling of motor oil, clapping until my palms stung. When the time came for college, I signed every overtime sheet I could. I didn't tell him the water in the bucket turned my hands raw in winter, or that I cleaned offices at night just to cover tuition. I wanted him to walk into classrooms without the burden of debt. I imagined him graduating, landing a good job, and maybe, one day, telling me to rest while he took care of me. When he married Madison, I sold my last fishing boat, the one Ellen had christened with a bottle of cheap champagne 2 decades earlier. With that money, I placed the down payment on a modest house in the suburbs. It was my gift to them, my way of making sure they started married life without worry. I moved into the small studio behind the garage. It suited me fine, 4 walls, a narrow bed, and enough space for my books and tools. I made my own meals, paid my share of utilities, and kept out of their way. I believed space would keep peace. But things shifted. Ethan stopped calling me Dad and started using Walter. The word sounded colder from his mouth than the Maine winters I'd worked through. The thank yous disappeared, replaced by silence or occasional irritation. At first, I blamed stress, told myself young couples have their struggles. Madison worked long hours, and Ethan was chasing promotions. Maybe they just needed room to breathe. Still, the air around the dinner table grew heavier. When I passed them in the hallway, they spoke softer, as though I wasn't meant to hear. Gratitude had turned into avoidance. I tried not to take it personally. Old men can be set in their ways, and I reminded myself I was lucky to even live near my son, when so many of my friends lived alone. My routine kept me steady. Mornings with black coffee, evenings with a bowl of soup, the hum of the radio filling the silence. Sometimes I'd tinker with small engines in the garage, the rhythm of tools calming my thoughts. I never asked for much, just a nod, a smile, some sign I still belonged in their lives. Mrs. O'Rourke, my neighbor, would knock on my door now and then with a pie wrapped in foil. She was a widow too and liked to gossip about the neighborhood. One afternoon, she leaned on my porch railing and said, "You're too kind for your own good, Walter. Folks mistake kindness for weakness." I laughed it off, but her words stuck in the back of my mind like a nail I couldn't pull out. Looking back, that was the warning. A man can survive storms at sea and sleepless nights in shipyards, but the quiet neglect under his own roof seeps into him differently. I told myself Ethan just needed time, that he would remember who carried him through childhood. Yet deep down, I sensed the balance shifting, the bond loosening. Mrs. O'Rourke's warning echoed faintly every night when I sat alone, sipping coffee gone cold, wondering if the silence in my family meant something darker was waiting ahead. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of this beginning, drop a number 1 in the comments so I know you're right here with me. It started small, like most turning points do. I noticed my hands trembling when I poured my morning coffee. The mug rattled against the counter, and a dark streak of coffee bled down the side. I told myself it was the cold, or maybe I hadn't slept enough, but I saw the way Madison's eyes lingered on me when she came into the kitchen. She was polite, careful with her words, yet there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. That evening, she left a pamphlet on the table, Comprehensive Health Screening in Boston. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, when she said, "Maybe you should get checked out, Walter. Just routine, you know." I agreed. At my age, there's no harm in making sure the body isn't hiding betrayals of its own. Still, part of me suspected the suggestion wasn't entirely about my health. Madison seemed to study me as if I were an appliance nearing the end of its warranty. I decided not to argue. Sometimes it's easier to go along and keep the peace. The drive to Boston was long, gray skies pressing down on the highway. Ethan sat behind the wheel, his jaw tight, fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. He didn't ask how I was feeling. Instead, he spoke about insurance deductibles, co-pays, and what he called sustainable solutions for the elderly. His words were clinical, as if I were a spreadsheet problem to be solved. I shifted in my seat and said quietly, "I only need respect. That's all." My voice was steady, not confrontational, just honest. He glanced at me briefly, then reached forward and turned up the radio until a wall of music drowned out any further words. The message was clear. He didn't want to hear me. I leaned back, staring at the blur of bare trees along the roadside, and felt the distance between us stretch wider than the miles we drove. At the clinic, Dr. Priya Shah greeted us warmly. She had kind eyes, the sort that made you feel less like a patient and more like a person. She asked questions with patience, about dizziness, about memory slips, about whether I had trouble managing daily tasks. I answered truthfully. My memory was intact, my balance only sometimes shaky. She nodded, taking notes, listening more to me than to the clipboard in her hands. Ethan, however, couldn't resist stepping in. "He forgets things all the time," he said quickly. "He leaves lights on, misplaces bills, sometimes repeats the same story twice in one night." His tone sharpened with each example, as if building a case. Madison sat quietly, nodding in subtle agreement. I kept my gaze on Dr. Shah, who didn't interrupt me but let Ethan's words hang there. I wanted to protest, but what good would that do? I knew I wasn't perfect, but his exaggerations turned human flaws into supposed proof of incompetence. Then came the moment. Dr. Shah asked a simple question. "Do you feel supported by your family day to day?" I opened my mouth, but Ethan sighed heavily, answering before I could. "Honestly, he's become a burden." The word landed like a stone in my chest. Burden, not father, not mentor, not the man who had held him through nights of fever, who had worked double shifts to buy his textbooks. Just a burden. I felt the air shift in the room. Dr. Shah froze mid-note, her pen hovering above the paper. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a second, I saw the sympathy she tried not to show. I smiled faintly, forcing composure. "Thank you, doctor," I said when the exam was finished, my voice calm. She gave me a long look, one that seemed to say she understood more than she could put into words. On the way back, the car was filled with silence, except for the radio Ethan cranked up again. I reached forward, turned the knob down, and let the quiet settle between us. He gripped the wheel tighter, but I didn't speak. Words were useless now. I stared out at the horizon, thinking of Ellen, wondering what she would say if she'd heard her son call me a burden. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my decision was already forming, though I said nothing. I would not confront him in anger. I would not plead for gratitude. Instead, I would carry that word, burden, like a secret ember, one that would burn quietly until it gave me the clarity I needed. Ethan thought the drive was just another routine appointment. He had no idea that somewhere between Boston and home, I had started building a plan, one made not of arguments or raised voices, but of silence, patience, and something far more decisive. If you're still watching and sensing the storm that's starting to form, leave a number 2 below to let me know you can feel it too. The evening after that appointment, I found a glossy stack of brochures sitting just outside the door of my little studio. I bent down, knees stiff, and picked them up. Across the front page was a photo of smiling seniors holding watercolor brushes and cups of tea. Comprehensive senior living, all inclusive, the heading said. I didn't need to guess where it came from. Madison had a way of sending messages without using words. She hadn't bothered to hand it to me directly, just left it there like a flyer meant for the trash. I sat down at my small table and flipped through the pages. Every photo was polished. Gardens, gyms, neatly folded towels. It was less an invitation and more a warning. This was the future they imagined for me, tucked away in a place where I wouldn't interfere with their lives. The next morning, Ethan appeared at my door with his laptop. He didn't knock, just walked in as though the studio was his. He turned the screen toward me, an Excel spreadsheet glowing under the harsh white cells. "Here's what it costs to keep things running," he said. There were columns for utilities, groceries, car insurance. At the bottom, a highlighted line read, "Dad's assets." He pointed to my old pickup, the one I'd driven for 20 years, still carrying the smell of salt and diesel. "We could sell this," he said. "It's not efficient. That money could go into a joint account with me just to simplify things." I looked at him, steady. "Whose name will be on that account?" "Mine," he answered quickly. "I'll manage it. It'll be easier that way." He said it like a foregone conclusion, as though my lifetime of work was now just a deposit for him to control. I didn't argue. Words would have no weight here. That night, when I turned on the shower, only cold water hissed out. I tried adjusting the knob, but nothing changed. I checked the small utility panel in the garage. The switch to the water heater had been locked with a padlock that hadn't been there before. My breath rose in clouds as I stood there, shivering under the icy spray. February in Maine was not forgiving, and neither, it seemed, was my son. Later, as I lay on the narrow bed, I heard their voices drifting in from the main house. The walls were thin enough that whispers carried. Madison was laughing softly, and Ethan's voice was clear enough for me to catch. "If Dad moves into a facility, we can knock out the kitchen wall by summer. Open floor plan. It'll add value." They spoke about me like I was drywall, something to remove, a barrier standing in the way of their dream renovation. My chest tightened, not from anger alone, but from the weight of realization. I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle. I rose and opened the small safe in the corner. Inside were the relics of my life. A bank book with years of savings, the IRA account statements, and Ellen's old life insurance policy I'd kept as proof that we had once built something together. I laid them out on the table like a deck of cards. My eyes lingered on each line, each number, each signature. They were not just papers, they were the story of my sacrifice. I picked up the phone and called Cole Whitman, my lawyer. He had been a friend of mine since Ellen's days, the kind of man who didn't need long explanations. "I need to see you tomorrow," I said. His voice was calm. "Morning works. 9 o'clock?" "Yes." I hung up and opened my worn leather notebook. In a blank space, I wrote, "No more arguments, only the road ahead." The house was quiet after midnight, but I couldn't sleep. The furnace clanked like an old man coughing, filling the silence with a tired wheeze. I sat at the table, staring at the brochures that still lay there, their glossy smiles mocking me. Finally, I folded them neatly and slid them into the trash. Before dawn, I packed a small bag. My heavy canvas jacket, a few shirts, my shaving kit, and Ellen's rosary went inside. It wasn't everything I owned, but it was enough to remind me who I was and where I'd come from. I sat on the edge of the bed, bag at my feet, and listened to the wind pressing against the windows. The cold seeped into the room, but it no longer mattered. Something colder had already taken root inside me. I knew then this was the beginning of something I could never turn back from. My son and his wife thought they were planning renovations, a new future without me. What they didn't know was that I, too, had begun my own plan, one that would strip away the illusion of their control. They believed they could decide my place in this house, in this family, in this life. But soon they would learn I wasn't a man to be managed. If you're still watching and the tension is pulling you in deeper, type number 3 in the comments so I know you're holding on tight. The next morning, I walked into Cole Whitman's office with the weight of a lifetime pressing on my shoulders. Cole had been Ellen's friend before he became mine, and he greeted me with that quiet steadiness only a seasoned lawyer carries. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where secrets could be turned into strategies. I laid the brochures, the spreadsheet, and even a photograph of the padlocked water heater on his desk. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Walter, they're building a case around you. If you don't protect yourself now, you might wake up one day to find your name erased from everything you worked for." The words struck with the precision of truth. He suggested setting up a revocable living trust, transferring all my assets into it, and revoking any prior power of attorney documents I had once signed in good faith. He explained that this would make it nearly impossible for Ethan to seize control through courts or banks. I agreed immediately. Over the next few days, I followed Cole's guidance like a soldier following orders. I opened a new bank account in my name alone, moving over my IRA, the savings account Ellen and I had once built together, and a small CD I'd left untouched for decades. I canceled the old debit card Ethan had been using as a backup and quietly shifted my most important documents, insurance policies, property deeds, even Ellen's will, into a safety deposit box at the bank. Every step felt like drawing back pieces of myself that I had once given freely. But financial armor wasn't enough. I needed proof of my strength, my clarity of mind. I scheduled a private appointment with Dr. Priya Shah, deliberately leaving Ethan out of the loop. When I sat across from her in that quiet examination room, I told her I wanted a complete cognitive evaluation. She ran the tests, memory recall, problem solving, simple arithmetic under pressure, and when it was over, she smiled gently. "You're sharp, Walter. Whatever else is happening at home, it's not because your mind is failing you." She promised to put that in writing. That assurance gave me air to breathe. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew Ethan would twist words if given the chance. So, I slipped a small recorder into my pocket during our household conversations. Maine allowed one-party consent, and I wasn't planning to make speeches, just capture the casual cruelty that might one day be denied. Each time Ethan suggested I was slipping, or implied I should start thinking about facilities, I pressed the button and let the tape roll. At night, I sat at the small wooden table in my studio, drafting what I called my map to freedom in a leather notebook. Each line was a step: book one-way ticket, withdraw cash in small increments, move deeds to the trust, close utilities before departure. Lisbon glowed on the page like a beacon. I had chosen it because Ellen had once circled it in a travel magazine, though we never made it there. Now I would. I bought a plane ticket under my full name, leaving in 3 weeks. I withdrew modest amounts of cash, no more than $100 each time, and tucked it into an envelope inside my canvas jacket. I bought a prepaid international SIM card and a cheap flip phone, what Cole called a burner, to set aside for the day I vanished. Outwardly, nothing changed. I ate dinner at the same time, nodded politely when Madison commented about groceries, and kept my voice even when Ethan reminded me to watch the thermostat. I played the part of the tired old man, quiet, compliant, hardly worth noticing. But inside, each act of silence was a stone laid on the path to my escape. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. Cole called me one afternoon, his voice tight. "Walter, Ethan filed a preliminary guardianship petition. He's trying to get the court to declare you incompetent." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The betrayal had reached the courts, a legal attempt to strip me not only of my house, but of my very autonomy. Cole assured me he would file a swift opposition, bolstered by Dr. Shah's evaluation. Still, the knowledge that my son had put my freedom on official paper hollowed something in me. When I met Dr. Shah again to request a statement, she frowned and said, "Walter, I never suggested you were impaired. If that's what your son told the court, it isn't true." Her words confirmed what I already feared. Ethan wasn't just careless, he was deliberate. He was reshaping reality to suit his narrative. That night, I sat with Ellen's rosary clutched in my hand, feeling its worn beads dig into my palm. The house creaked in the winter wind, and I knew without question that I had passed a point of no return. My son thought he was building walls around me, but in truth, he had opened the door to something far more dangerous: my resolve. If you're still watching and realizing things aren't as simple as they seemed, drop a number 4 below to show you're catching every detail. The air in the house had changed. Meals became silent affairs, with Madison scrolling on her phone and Ethan talking more about contractors than about family. He mentioned knocking down walls, widening the kitchen, and turning my studio into a guest suite. He didn't say it to me directly, but his tone carried the assumption that I would no longer be there. I felt like a shadow in my own home, walking from room to room with the clear knowledge that my presence was unwelcome. One evening, as snow tapped against the windows, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. He wasn't alone. A man in a dark overcoat followed him inside, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Madison set out coffee cups like she had been expecting company. I sat at the table, my hands folded, watching. "This is Mr. Carver," Ethan said, his voice steady but too rehearsed. "He's here to help us streamline things for the future." Carver opened his briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of papers. The top page bore my name in bold letters. "These are just some preliminary authorizations," he explained smoothly. "By signing here, Walter, you'd allow Ethan to help manage your finances and make certain decisions on your behalf. It's purely for convenience." I didn't move. My eyes traced the words on the page, legal phrases designed to look harmless but weighted with power. I knew this was the guardianship in disguise, the tightening of a noose they thought I wouldn't notice. Ethan leaned forward, impatience leaking through his smile. "Dad, it's better this way. Less paperwork for you, less confusion. You trust me, don't you?" I said nothing. My silence seemed to ignite something in him. His voice hardened. "You've been making mistakes. Leaving bills unpaid, forgetting simple things. You can't keep living like this. You need me to take over." The man across from me adjusted his tie, waiting for my signature. Madison's eyes flicked toward me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, it was calculation. Still, I didn't speak. Finally, Ethan's patience snapped. He slammed his palm against the table, the papers scattering. "You're nothing but a burden. Do you hear me? A burden. Always in the way. Always holding us back." His words came like blows, each one sharper than the last. Madison, perhaps emboldened by his outburst, added in her cool, even voice, "Honestly, Walter, a facility would give you better care. And it would give us breathing room." I could feel my heart pounding, but my hands remained steady. Without a word, I reached beneath the table and set down a small folder. I opened it slowly, sliding out each piece one by one. The trust document signed by Cole, the evaluation from Dr. Shah affirming my mental clarity, the recordings I had transcribed showing Ethan's own words about getting rid of me. The room fell quiet. Ethan's eyes darted across the documents. His face lost its color, then flushed red. He stammered, reaching for an explanation that never came. Carver cleared his throat and began packing up his briefcase, clearly unwilling to remain in the middle of what was unraveling. Madison's mouth tightened. the confident lines of her face collapsing into unease. In that silence, the balance of power shifted. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't the old man in the corner. I was the one holding the ground, unshaken. Ethan tried to speak again, softer this time. "Dad, I didn't mean—" I raised my hand, stopping him. My voice was quiet but final. "Enough." The word cut sharper than any shout. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was resolve, ... I gathered the papers back into the folder, stood, and walked toward the stairs. The house seemed to hold its breath as I climbed, each step deliberate. In my room, I closed the door gently and sat on the bed. My passport lay on the nightstand, next to the one-way ticket to Lisbon. I picked them up, feeling their weight. No one would lock me away again. Not in a bathroom, not in paperwork, not in silence. Downstairs, I could hear muffled voices, Ethan's sharp, Madison's tight with fear, but I no longer cared. Their words no longer had power. The decision had been made, the battle lines had been drawn, and for once, I was the one dictating the terms. I pressed Ellen's rosary into my palm and whispered to the empty room, "They will never chain me twice." I sat in my room long after the confrontation downstairs, the muffled sound of Ethan and Madison's voices seeping through the floorboards. Their words blurred into a constant drone of anger, blame, and fear. I didn't need to catch every sentence. The tone told me everything. They were fighting because of me, because their plans had crumbled the moment I laid those documents on the table. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt hollow, drained. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the framed photo of Ethan as a boy on his first day of school. His face was bright, his hand gripping mine tightly. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who looked at me as though I were an obstacle instead of a father. The ache in my chest was sharp, not from the betrayal itself, but from the memory of what we once had. I thought of all the nights I worked overtime, the mornings I skipped breakfast so Ethan could have enough for lunch. I thought of the years spent cleaning offices, hauling crates, repairing fences, anything to give him a life I had never known. And now, after all that, I was the old man locked out of warmth, locked into silence, and nearly locked into legal papers that would have stripped me of everything. Two paths stretched before me, clear as the snowy street outside the window. One was to stay. I could continue to endure the cold showers, the mocking laughter, the whispered plans to remove me. If I stayed, Ethan might succeed in pushing me into a facility, signing away my rights until I became a ghost, living under someone else's authority. The second path was to leave, to walk away from the house I bought, the son I raised, the illusions I held on to for too long. Leaving meant freedom, but it also meant solitude. No family dinners, no grandchildren's laughter, no ties to the life Ellen and I had once imagined. Ellen. Her name stirred something in me. I closed my eyes and remembered her voice, calm but firm from so many years ago. "Walter," she once told me, "never let your sacrifices turn into chains. Give, but don't let giving become your prison." At the time, I thought she was speaking about small things, working too many hours, saying yes when I should have said no. Now, decades later, her words rose like a lighthouse beam through the fog. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the leather notebook. The pages were filled with my careful handwriting, each step mapped out like coordinates. Open trust, secure bank account, confirm deed, book ticket, gather cash. This notebook wasn't just a plan anymore. It was my key, my way forward. I flipped to the last page and wrote one simple line: "Today I choose to live for myself." I set down the pen and reached into the closet. My suitcase was there, already half packed. I checked the contents again: passport, one-way ticket to Lisbon, copies of my financial documents, a few clothes, and Ellen's rosary. Everything else could stay behind. Everything else belonged to a life I no longer recognized. Morning came slowly, gray light spilling through the curtains. I heard Madison in the kitchen clattering dishes, Ethan muttering something sharp in reply. I moved quietly, slipping the notebook back into the drawer and zipping my suitcase shut. Then I carried it to the door of my studio and set it against the wall. Before breakfast, I stepped outside onto the porch. The snow had stopped, leaving a thin crust of ice on the roof and the driveway. I stood there, breathing in the cold air, letting it fill my lungs. The house loomed behind me, not as a home, but as a shell. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I no longer loved it. The memories here had been poisoned by betrayal, and the walls that once echoed with Ellen's laughter now carried only resentment. I whispered to the empty yard, "They think I'm weak, but I choose to leave." For a moment, the words hung in the frosty air, disappearing into the morning stillness. My chest felt lighter. The decision had been made. There would be no turning back. When I went inside, I sat at the table with them one last time. Madison asked if I wanted toast, her voice forced, brittle. Ethan didn't look at me. I smiled faintly, nodding, but said nothing more. Silence was the only language they deserved now. Deep inside, I was already gone. If you're still watching and can feel how heavy this decision is, write number 6 in the comments so I know you're with me in this moment. The days that followed my decision were filled with a kind of silence that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Ethan and Madison still moved through the house, but their rhythm had changed. The air was tense, every conversation between them sharp, clipped, and carrying the weight of blame. I often heard my name whispered in the middle of their arguments, not with affection, but as a curse. Ethan grew restless. He slammed doors more often, muttered when bills arrived in the mail, and paced the living room like a man with too much on his mind and too little control. He had expected me to fold, to give him everything he wanted. Instead, I had drawn a line he couldn't cross, and it infuriated him. At dinner one night, he sneered across the table and said, "Maybe if you actually kept up with things, we wouldn't have to clean up after you." I didn't answer. My silence was my shield now, but the look in his eyes told me he hated that shield more than any words I could have spoken. Madison, on the other hand, began to shift. The sharpness in her tone softened, not toward me but toward her husband. I heard her warning him late at night when they thought I was asleep. "Don't push him too far, Ethan. This isn't going the way we planned. You're only making it worse." Her voice carried a thread of fear, as if she had started to realize what I already knew. Ethan's anger wasn't a tool, it was a fire burning out of control. The cracks between them widened. Madison avoided the living room when Ethan was in one of his moods. She moved quietly, almost cautiously, as though afraid of what might come next. I noticed it all, but I didn't comment. It wasn't my war anymore. My part in this story was nearly finished, and I had no desire to intervene in the collapse of their marriage. Still, it was impossible not to feel the ache of loss. Some evenings I walked through the house when no one was around, letting my eyes trace the details I had once been proud of. The oak banister I had sanded smooth with my own hands. The window frames Ellen and I had painted one summer afternoon, laughing when the wind blew paint flecks into our hair. Every corner carried a memory, and each memory weighed heavier because I knew they would no longer belong to me. The house had become a mausoleum of what once was, filled not with life, but with ghosts. I stood in the kitchen one night, running my hand across the counter where Ellen used to knead bread. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and almost heard her humming. When I opened them again, I saw only Madison's magazines scattered across the surface, and Ethan's half-empty beer bottles in the sink. The contrast was unbearable. I walked back to my studio, shutting the door behind me as though sealing off the last fragments of my past. My preparations grew more deliberate. Each day I withdrew a little more cash, careful not to raise suspicion. I checked the envelope where I kept it, adding to the quiet pile that would carry me across the ocean. I reviewed the documents Cole had secured, making sure nothing had been left undone. My suitcase, already packed, sat in the corner like a silent reminder of the life that waited just beyond the horizon. Only a week remained before my flight. The knowledge steadied me. Every insult from Ethan, every cold glance from Madison became easier to bear because I knew the countdown had begun. They thought they were tightening their grip, but in truth, I was already slipping free. One night, I sat by the window with the rosary in my hands. The house was quiet. the kind of heavy quiet that comes after a storm. Outside, the snow had melted into dark patches of earth, the street glistening under the streetlights. I whispered into the night, "Tomorrow it begins." Tomorrow, their plans would falter. Tomorrow, the weight of their schemes would start to collapse. But I wouldn't be here to see the rubble fall. I would be far away, beyond their reach, carrying nothing but my dignity and the freedom I had fought so quietly to protect. The following week was a blur of careful steps, each one designed to look ordinary while carrying the weight of finality. I drove into town one morning and sat across from Cole in his oak-paneled office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and leather. He slid a neat stack of documents toward me. With a steady hand, I signed the final pages that moved every dollar, every deed, every asset into the trust. My name stood alone on every line. Ethan would never touch a cent, no matter how hard he tried. Cole looked at me with a rare softness when it was done. "You've built a wall they can't climb," he said. Afterward, I walked to the bank and opened a new international account. The clerk, unaware of the history tied to each dollar, smiled politely as she finalized the paperwork. I watched as my assets shifted into a place Ethan would never find. It was like lowering the final latch on a locked door. I also arranged for all utility bills, electric, water, and insurance, to close the morning after my departure. By the time Ethan realized what had happened, he'd be left with nothing but overdue notices. At home, I kept my mask in place. I joined them at the dinner table, nodded when Madison talked about grocery lists, and even accompanied her once to the store. I gave Ethan curt but neutral replies when he spoke about household chores. The more I played the part of the beaten-down old man, the more convinced they became that they had won. They didn't notice the quiet fire smoldering beneath the calm exterior. In the evenings, I sat in my studio and packed with precision. The suitcase in the corner grew heavier. Passport, ticket to Lisbon, copies of trust documents, the rosary Ellen once held, and enough cash to begin again. The rest, the furniture, the books, the tools, would stay behind like discarded shells. They weren't mine anymore, not truly. They belonged to the past. But not everything went smoothly. One night, I heard Ethan's footsteps in the hallway, heavier than usual. My door creaked open before I could react. His eyes landed on the suitcase, zipped tight and waiting in the corner, his brow furrowed, suspicion flashing like a knife. "What's this?" he demanded. I kept my face calm. "I was tidying up," I said, my voice even. "That room's been cluttered long enough. Thought I'd get things in order." His gaze lingered, sharp and probing. I met it without flinching, my heartbeat steady in my chest. After a moment, he gave a short, dismissive laugh and walked away. But I caught the flicker of doubt in his expression. He suspected something, though he didn't yet understand. I made a note to be more careful, to play the role more convincingly. The next day, I went about my routine with practiced normalcy. I made my coffee, read the paper, and asked Madison politely about her errands. Outwardly, I was the same man they thought they had beaten down. Inwardly, I was already halfway across the ocean. That evening, I pulled out my small notebook under the warm glow of my desk lamp. I read through the checklist, each step marked with a firm line. Trust signed, bank secured, ticket booked, utilities scheduled for closure, taxi arranged. Everything was in place. The only thing left was to leave. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember Ellen again. I could almost hear her voice in the quiet of the room, steady and sure. "Don't let your sacrifices become chains." She had been right all along. For too many years, I had let my devotion weigh me down, allowed gratitude to blind me. Now, I was finally unshackling myself. I picked up my pen and wrote the final line in the notebook. "Everything is ready. Tomorrow, I step out that door and my freedom begins." I closed the book and set it beside the suitcase. The house around me was still, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. I knew Ethan and Madison were downstairs, unaware that the life they thought was secure was about to collapse. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and anticipation. The sorrow was for the family I once believed I had. The anticipation was for the life waiting beyond these walls, a life no one could take from me. I turned off the lamp, the room plunging into soft darkness, and lay back on the bed. For the first time in years, I felt the calm certainty of a man who had chosen his own path. Tomorrow, the world I had built for them would vanish, and mine would finally begin. If you're still watching and searching for the light within all this chaos, leave a number 8 below so I know you're walking this road with me. The morning of my departure arrived shrouded in fog. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy quiet that presses against your chest. I rose before dawn, the cold floor creaking under my feet. My suitcase was already waiting by the door, zipped and ready. I slipped an envelope into my coat pocket. The house keys, a final letter for Cole, and the paperwork he would need for the new owners later that day. It felt almost ceremonial, like sealing the door to a chapter of my life I would never reopen. I moved through the studio slowly, my hand brushing over the dresser, the lamp, the chair where I had spent countless evenings writing in my notebook. None of it would follow me. These objects belonged to a life I was leaving behind. I paused at the window and watched as headlights pierced the mist. The taxi driver stepped out, his breath puffing into the cold morning air as he opened the trunk. My ride to freedom was waiting. Before stepping outside, I turned once more toward the house. It loomed in the half-light, silent and still. For decades, it had been my anchor, my gift, my prison. I no longer felt warmth when I looked at it, only the echo of what used to be. I closed the door gently behind me, no goodbye, no hesitation. The click of the lock sounded like the last nail in a coffin. The taxi ride was silent. I didn't check my phone, didn't glance back. The driver hummed to himself softly, unaware that he was carrying a man who had just severed himself from an entire world. As we merged onto the highway, I pressed my palm against the envelope inside my chute. Everything was in motion now. By the time Ethan woke, I was already halfway to the airport. He would have rolled out of bed, groggy and unsuspecting, expecting the world to remain as it had always been. Instead, he would find strangers in his living room. The young couple had been eager to move in quickly. I could picture their polite smiles as movers carried boxes past him, their voices calm as they said, "We're the new owners. We closed last week." I imagined the way his face must have drained of color, his breath caught in his throat. He would have called my name, stormed down the hall to my studio, only to find the drawers empty, the closet bare, the safe gone. My presence, once an inconvenience in his eyes, would be nothing but absence, the kind of absence that screamed louder than any confrontation. He would call me, of course, again and again, first with anger, then with desperation, then with panic. Each call would ring into silence. I had no intention of answering. I had no interest in explaining. My silence would be my final word. Madison would blame him. I knew her well enough to predict that. Her voice sharp, her eyes full of cold fury as she asked, "What have you done? Where will we live now?" Their marriage, already fraying, would begin to unravel under the weight of that loss. And for once, I would not be the glue holding things together. They would be forced to carry the weight of their choices. At the airport, I moved like a man unburdened. Security checks, boarding passes, the shuffle of travelers around me, all of it passed in a blur. When I sat down by the window of the plane, my chest loosened in a way it hadn't in years. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, I looked down at the shrinking city. Somewhere below, Ethan was learning the truth. The house was never his. The life he built on my sacrifice had vanished overnight. The clouds swallowed the skyline, and I whispered to myself, they thought I was a burden. I carried away their whole world. Hours later, the wheels touched down on a new continent. The air that greeted me was warmer, filled with scents unfamiliar yet welcoming. I stepped onto the tarmac, sunlight spilling across my face. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's father, someone's caretaker, someone's afterthought. I was simply myself, free. I walked forward, one hand clutching Ellen's rosary in my pocket. I could almost hear her laugh in the wind, urging me onward. Behind me, chains had fallen. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and unclaimed. I hadn't run away. I had chosen. and that choice was the truest revenge of all. I sat on the narrow balcony of my small apartment in Lisbon, the Atlantic stretching out before me in shades of silver and blue. The sun was setting, and the water caught the light in such a way that it looked as if the ocean itself was burning. I breathed deeply, tasting salt in the air, and for the first time in decades, I felt no weight pressing down on my shoulders. The chains of resentment, the sting of humiliation, the endless ache of being treated as a burden, they had all been left behind when I chose to disappear. Now there was only silence, and in that silence, I finally discovered freedom. I thought back to the long years when my life revolved around others, when every decision I made was guided by sacrifice. I had convinced myself that love, when given freely and without limit, would always come back in some form of respect or gratitude. I learned the hard way that this is not always true. Some people take love and twist it into entitlement. Some people see sacrifice not as devotion, but as weakness. My son had looked at me in the doctor's office and seen not a father who gave everything but a problem that needed solving. That word, burden, echoed in my mind for days, but now, with the sea as my witness, it no longer had power over me. Life has a cruel way of teaching us the lessons we try hardest to avoid. I wanted to believe that family ties were unbreakable, that blood itself was enough to guarantee loyalty. But love without boundaries breeds dependency, and dependency can turn to contempt. My mistake was not the love I gave, but the belief that it would always be valued. The truth is simple and devastating. Not all children grow into the adults we hope they will become. Some forget, some betray, and some, like my son, turn the very hand that fed them into the hand that pushes us away. But here is what I know now. Dignity is not theirs to take. No matter what words are spoken, no matter how cruel the treatment, no one can strip you of your worth unless you allow it. For too long, I allowed my silence to be mistaken for weakness, my patience mistaken for surrender. The day I transferred every cent I had and walked away was the day I reclaimed the right to define myself. That act was not revenge, it was liberation. I think of others, people like me, parents who have poured their lives into their children only to be left discarded, dismissed, forgotten. To them, I would say this: you are not alone. You are not powerless. You do not owe endless loyalty to those who repay you with scorn. Love must be free, not chained to expectation. And when that love becomes a prison, you must be brave enough to step outside its walls. The greatest lesson I carry now is that silence can be louder than any argument. I did not scream. I did not demand apologies. I simply vanished from his world. And in that void, he will come to understand what he has lost. My absence is a mirror, one he will be forced to look into every day. And in that reflection, he will see not just the father he cast aside, but the man who finally refused to be broken. Each morning, I wake to the sound of waves instead of slammed doors. I drink coffee slowly, watching gulls wheel over the harbor. No one tells me I am in the way. No one scolds me for breathing too loudly, or for existing in spaces they believe are theirs. This simplicity, this quiet, is worth more than any inheritance, any house, any illusion of security I left behind. As I sit here, I realize that my story is not only mine. It belongs to every parent who wonders if love was wasted, to every soul who has felt the sting of betrayal within their own home. What I want them to take from my journey is this: freedom is not given, it is claimed. And dignity is never lost unless you abandon it yourself. I whispered to the wind, almost without meaning to. I am not a burden. I am myself. The words carried out toward the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the sea, but they lingered in my heart. That was my truth, my final message. The sun sank lower, setting the waves aflame with orange and red. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth wash over me. My story had ended not with bitterness, but with clarity. Family should protect, not imprison. Love should uplift, not diminish. Respect, once given, should never have to be begged for again. He locked me away in shame. I walked away into freedom. That is the message I leave behind. Life has a way of testing the very core of who we are. It strips away the illusions we hold about permanence, about loyalty, about the bonds that we believe are unbreakable. In those moments of trial, when trust is fractured and love is weighed against convenience, the truth reveals itself. And often, that truth is not gentle. It is sharp, cutting through the stories we tell ourselves about family, sacrifice, and devotion. Yet from this sharpness comes clarity. There is a point at which a person realizes that their worth cannot be measured by the gratitude or ingratitude of others. Dignity is not something bestowed, it is something inherent, something no betrayal can erase. To live a life shackled by the opinions of those who do not value us is to give away the freedom that belongs to us by birth. True strength lies not in clinging to what diminishes us, but in letting go with quiet resolve. In letting go, something remarkable happens. The silence that follows is not emptiness, but space. Space to breathe, to think, to rediscover the parts of oneself that had been overshadowed by endless compromise. It is within that space that peace begins to grow. The absence of noise, the absence of judgment, the absence of control. It becomes fertile ground for a life that is finally one's own. And from that ground, resilience blossoms. Freedom is not always found in grand gestures or sweeping victories. More often, it is found in the smallest choices. The choice to walk away rather than argue. The choice to stand tall rather than beg. The choice to invest energy into a future that no longer depends on someone else's approval. Each of these choices builds a foundation stronger than stone, one that cannot be toppled by shifting loyalties or broken promises. There is a lesson in the way betrayal reshapes a life. Betrayal does not have to be the end of the story. It can become the beginning of a truer chapter. Pain has a way of forcing us to see what we once ignored. It teaches us that unconditional giving, without boundaries, can sometimes plant seeds of entitlement rather than gratitude. It shows us that love is not weakness, but without respect, love becomes a prison. And it reminds us that sometimes the bravest act is not to fight louder, but to walk away in silence, carrying dignity intact. With distance comes wisdom. Looking back from the calm of a new horizon, one can see that the weight of resentment was heavier than the loss itself. By stepping away, the bitterness begins to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding that every ending is an invitation to begin again. The ties that once chained a heart can transform into wings that carry it forward. In solitude, in independence, in the rediscovery of self-worth, a person can finally rest in the knowledge that they are whole, even without the validation of those they once lived for. This is not a story of revenge, though it may look like it from the outside. It is a story of liberation. It is a reminder that revenge shouts, but liberation whispers, and it is the whisper that echoes longest. Choosing freedom over bitterness, dignity over dependency, peace over conflict, these are not signs of weakness, but of profound courage. They are the markers of a life reclaimed. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth. No one can dictate the measure of a life except the one who lives it. No rejection can define a person unless they allow it. The world will always hold voices ready to diminish, ready to dismiss, ready to label. But those voices lose all power when met with silence and with the unshakable knowledge of one's worth. In the end, life is not about what is taken from us, but about what we choose to keep within ourselves. We can keep bitterness, or we can keep peace. We can keep anger, or we can keep dignity. We can remain chained to betrayal, or we can walk freely into a horizon of our own making. The choice is ours, and in that choice lies the quiet, unwavering triumph of the human spirit. Because true freedom does not come from what others give us. It comes from what we claim for ourselves, in the stillness after the storm, when we decide that no one has the right to cage our dignity ever again. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.